I believe that state leaders have an obligation to the residents throughout Missouri to ensure their health, safety, and welfare, making sure they have proper information to be informed, making sure that we have the proper precautions in place to mitigate the community spread, and making sure that we have enough resources in state for the PPE, the personal protective equipment, as well as any medical equipment necessary for us to be able to meet the needs associated with COVID-19. I will tell you, this is the most vulnerable population that we have, which are senior citizens. These are individuals who we've entrusted to the care of healthcare professionals to make sure that they are safe and that they're addressing their medical needs. All the while they're being sequestered and have been for many of them 6 months or more to try to mitigate the amount of interaction they have with people that have been in other populations. Unfortunately, we're seeing a huge outbreak in those communities because of the regulations don't really reflect the risks associated. You have staff that are able to come in and out, and they may not be properly tested as often as they should be. And then you have people who are dealing with mental health challenges now from being isolated for such a long period of time, and just the fear that's associated with the unknown. I think we need to be more clear on what our guidelines are going to be on those that are going to come in contact with that population, as well as being more prescriptive and providing them with some social interactions and supports, or alternative ways for them to have personal interaction with their loved ones. And then also having the Office of Advocacy really doing its job. This administration has not been effective at utilizing it to allow the loved ones to be able to express their complaints and following up on those complaints in a timely manner, as well as providing relevant information to those families to be a proper advocate, to making sure they're fully informed when there's cases of outbreaks, instead of them just hearing it on the news. All segments of society are important. There's no one without the other. We need them all to function effectively because there's a correlation amongst them. I think the most important thing we can do is manage the how we are addressing COVID-19 and making sure that we are minimizing the community spread. I cannot emphasize that enough, because if you allow one area of industry to open up and not others, then it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. I think we have to be very clear on what are the best practices to minimize community spread. Obviously, wearing a face covering, washing your hands, social distancing, all those things are good practices for those that have to interact and are essential workers. But for those that are still looking to socialize and be involved in open up tourism and things like that, I think we still may be a little premature in that, because we've seen where that has occurred. We've seen larger outbreaks in some school districts and otherwise. So I believe we have to make sure that we are managing the risk associated with where we are as far as our levels of how many people are being tested positive, as well as making sure we are educating across the board those that have to interact with the public on how to do that in the most safest way possible, and so that we can continue to do business in an effective manner. Because the goal is not for us to be like this long term. If we make the sacrifices now, we can get back to some level of normalcy. But right now, our positive test rate is continuing to increase. As we've seen here in Jackson County, Kansas City, we're at 15%. And we've seen statewide, we've exceeded 100,000 positive cases of COVID. Thankfully, the deaths have not been that largely associated with those large numbers, but still the amount of risk that's been associated just tells us that we have the risk of exponential growth. And we've got to get that underway so that we can look to industry and figure out the best ways to get back to doing business. MDFB is important because the goal of that board is to find opportunities for large scale economic development and to be able to provide catalyst dollars or seed money for some of those projects. I think one way to be innovative in how we do that effectively is looking to leverage federal funds. We have CARES Act dollars that are in place. We're going to have some industries that are going to be needing some additional supports. And how do we leverage our local dollars along with the federal subsidies that are coming in to make sure that we're maximizing the impact to boost our economic recovery? Some examples of that would be whether the need be housing, or maybe the need is going to be some kind of workplace development type of programming, or new buildings for some type of, PPE is huge now. We don't know how long it's going to be. So let's say there's some new manufacturer that comes in and is going to need to, willing to do that here in Missouri. So there are a number of different ways we can look at this. I think we need to be open to innovative approaches on how we leverage those dollars and not just stay contained to how we've always done things, because there are federal dollars that could be leveraged. And I think we don't want to miss those opportunities. Well, one thing we know is that if you look at, regardless of where people are, or regardless of income level, you're seeing some of the same trends where they may be charged higher rates of interest, or the disparities in learning outcomes, even in affluent school districts where families are not free and reduced lunch. We're seeing these disparities. I think that's why it's extremely important that we have culturally competent leadership at the helm at this hour. People are in the streets protesting and crying out for social change, social justice, and for people's civil rights and liberties to be protected. And that's not a far cry. These are reasonable asks that they're requesting. But what we've seen is that leadership and the way that many of these institutions function are hard to change. You look at education. We've had, as recently as Lee Summit, in maybe the last year or so, Lee Summit, Missouri, we saw it was a big eruption over equity in education and disparity in learning outcomes. And these were not low-income families. They just were families of color, and there was a big difference. I believe the same thing applies in healthcare as well as in finance and banking relationships. People who don't have the relationships oftentimes are charged more interest or not getting the preferential loans. And even in healthcare, you see with Black women, the maternal mortality rate is a lot higher. Black women die during childbirth because you have people who are in these fields who are not culturally competent, who are making decisions that may not be in the best interest of all people. Sometimes it's out of ignorance. They just don't know the differences. They're not culturally competent. And sometimes it's because of just willing ignorance. And they just willful ignorance. I'm sorry. They just don't want to be engaged, don't want to know this is how I'm going to do it, and how it affects you. It doesn't matter. Well, those type of situations cause a disparate impact on communities of color. And we have to have people in leadership that's going to call it out. We have to have people in legislative positions who are going to put protections in place to protect all Missourians, regardless of your color, regardless of your income, to make sure that your rights are protected, even in instances like this. And so I believe that there is a huge opportunity for us in Missouri to get this right now. When you have leadership that is not acknowledging the requests of constituents in the street saying that Black Lives Matter and that we're against police brutality, and the response is, I stand with police. No, we stand for accountability, regardless of if it's a police officer or if it's a Joe citizen that's committed a crime. We don't want lawlessness of any kind, particularly those that have a badge. And so we have to look at this across the board and make sure that we're not putting one against the other, and we're looking at it holistically and figuring out what is going to be the right way from a policy standpoint, what is going to be the right way from a morality standpoint for us to be able to get things right where it's fair and equal across the board. I think there's a couple ways we have to do this. We want our properties to accumulate value. I mean, that's, you buy land, you want it to accumulate value. That's how you create wealth. Well, but we also have to protect those families who are in those homes that have been there for, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, some of them, and are on fixed incomes now. And so once their property appreciates exponentially in a short amount of time, and then their property taxes become just kind of, triple or quadruple, and their incomes aren't able to sustain that, we have to protect that. And so there are some ways we can proactively do tax abatements and freeze taxes on properties of long-standing homeowners and communities that are gentrifying, so to speak. But also there are some things that we have to do intentionally from a policy standpoint to increase the capacity of affordable housing units. And we're talking about affordable housing for families. That's 3 and 4 bedroom units for families. Many of them cannot pay market rate. The market rate for a 3-bedroom home in a good school district and safe neighborhood is probably about $1,500 a month in Kansas City right now. Well, if someone is making $40,000 a year with 3 or 4 kids, probably can't afford that. So they can't afford market rent, but they probably can afford somewhere between $700 and $900 a month, or maybe even up to $1,000 a month. Well, the market really, you need something to kind of make it affordable. And so what type of tools are we willing to put on the table using low-income housing tax credits, other type of tax abatements to be able to accomplish our goal of increasing the demand of affordable housing units? And so I believe through policy, through use of incentives that are prescriptive to solve a need for housing shortage in the demand area. The Mid-America Regional Council has suggested for the Kansas City market, the demand is for 3-bedroom units. And so right now, what we're subsidizing are luxury 1-bedroom apartments. Well, for someone who needs a 3-bedroom unit, that doesn't really help them. And I would argue that a $1,200 1-bedroom unit is not very affordable either. So you see where there's a mismatch on where the market is building and where the demand is. We've got to close that gap. And I think we have to be intentional as policymakers to cause the market to be willing to fill that need. And I think we have the tools to do it effectively. Well, it's to be determined. And I say that because I understand what the intent is behind it. We're dealing with record number of homicides across the state. Missouri has 3 of the top 15 deadliest cities: Kansas City, St. Louis, and Springfield, Missouri. But what that also tells you that this issue of gun violence goes beyond race and income, because you're having the same problem in Springfield, Missouri, and they don't have the same demographic that we have here in Kansas City. And so I think that when you look at what Operation Legend is intended to do, which is support law enforcement on how to clear their outstanding homicide investigation cases and dealing with some of the gun assault cases, I think that is a good thing if it's helping clear the workload and helping police to be able to learn more effective ways to do their jobs, and not necessarily busting the budget of the local municipalities. But at the same time, we have to be careful about what the effect of that is going to be, and caution them against over policing in some ways, and that they remain focused on what the task is at hand, is addressing violent crime and being able to solve these investigations, because these families want justice, and we want them to get justice. And law enforcement needs help sometimes from their partners to be able to make that happen. But we want them to keep the main thing the main thing. So we're watching to make sure that remains the case. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the disparities in education. It transcends income. And so the digital divide in Missouri, I mean, it's a rural issue and an urban issue. In the rural areas, it's accessibility. They don't have access to it. In the urban communities, it's affordability. And so we have to figure out from our model of education, how are we going to address this unmet need across the board? Right now, broadband internet is a utility, and we have to make sure that all kids have access to it, just like they do lights, water, and gas. And so how does the school district build that in its model to make sure kids all have access? The hotspots are a good start, but it may not be the most effective, because if you're on Zoom all day, you're going to eat up the data on your hotspot. So we need to figure out ways to work with our internet service providers to look at the funding allocations that we provide for public education, to see how we can leverage those dollars to make internet affordable where it's available, and then for us to broaden and expand connectivity for areas that it's not. My message to the voters of Missouri is we need you to show up. Every election is an important election, but this one is a pivotal one, because you are deciding what future your children are going to have. There are a number of protections that are on the legislative chopping block, so to speak. Voter protections, equal protections, tax issues as far as small businesses, and healthcare options, so criminal justice reform. Are we going to have accountability for police officers that, are negligent in how they, not just negligent, they criminally murder unarmed citizens? How are we going to address these things in the upcoming months and years to come? It's going to be decided on the leadership that we decide on November the 3rd. Get my dates right, November the 3rd. But I will tell you, for those who don't think their vote matters, I implore you to recognize that it does. I got my start in politics in 2015. I won my primary, a very contested primary election, by merely 12 votes. 12 people decided my fate and how my political trajectory was going to follow. And so as a result of that, I am before you today as a candidate for lieutenant governor, and hoping that I have the opportunity to serve you, to uplift your voices, to create access and more opportunities, and make sure that I continue to empower you to stay civically engaged in the years to come. This is not a one-time thing. This is a long-term approach, and we need you to show up on November the 3rd and cast your ballot for leadership that matters and is going to be responsive to your needs. So thank you guys for listening today, and I look forward to serving you in the future.